Hello, everyone. Today I bring you a follow-up presentation to my previous one on the work of the study of history by Arnold Toynbee. In this part, we're looking at the Genesis section of the abridged A Study of History. This is taken from materials in volumes 1 and 2 of the original work. Chapter 4, The Problem and How Not to Solve It. 1. The problem stated. Of the 21 societies, 15 are affiliated to one another in some capacity. The other 6 directly spring from primitive life. These are the Egyptiac, the Sumeric, the Minoan, the Cynic, the Mayan, and the Andean. A key difference between primitive societies and the non-primitive societies is the direction of what Toynbee terms mimesis or imitation. Primitive societies direct their mimesis towards their elders and ancestors, resulting in a culture which is static. In contrast, non-primitive societies direct their mimesis towards exceptional and creative individuals, which breaks down the cake of custom, and the society moves along a course of change and growth. This difference is not permanent, and we only view primitive societies as static, as we can only see evidence of their latter stages. Toynbee then takes us through an analogy. Imagine societies as rock climbers trying to climb a treacherous cliff face. The climbers who have failed the test are lying paralytic are the primitive societies, whilst the climbers who have succeeded are the growing societies. However, though they have climbed this cliff face, they will not necessarily be able to climb every cliff face they come across. Therefore, human life is either static or dynamic, and throughout the rest of the section, Toynbee searches for the positive factor, which sets humanity from the latter to the former state. 2. Race. In this part, Toynbee explores the idea that race is the positive factor. Race is defined as possession of some distinctive and inheritable quality in a particular group of human beings. By Toynbee, and the argument supposes there are valuable psychic and physical qualities which correlate amongst certain peoples. He rejects the ideas of Arthur de Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who both argued that a Nordic race is the driving impulse of Western civilization. Toynbee then lists all the different races which can be identified. Rather than characterise white as one race, he breaks them down into 3. That of the Nordic, the Alpine, and the Mediterranean, all 3 of which have contributed to different societies, sometimes in combination with one another. For example, Toynbee identifies the Hellenic and Western societies as having some combination of all 3 white races. The other races Toynbee identifies are brown, South Asians, yellow, East Asians, red, Amerindians, and black, Africans. As we can see, his view of race is pluralistic, as he believes societies are the product of multiple races cooperating rather than the product of one particular race. Therefore, race is not, in his view, the positive factor. 3. Environment. In this part, Toynbee explores the idea that environment is the positive factor. The ancient Greeks were the first to postulate that environment was the cause of differentiation amongst different cultures. Toynbee argues this is because the world the Greeks had to interact with was sufficiently smaller, and though culturally diverse, it was less racially differentiated compared to the world which Western man has interacted with. Though Toynbee believes there is some merit to environmental factors, he believes they are ultimately insufficient. He argues this because there is no consistent pattern of behaviour across the same type of environment. For example, he notes both the Eurasian steppe and the Eurasian steppe have historically birthed nomadic societies. However, there are some similar environments to be found in the world, such as the Australian grasslands and the Pampas in Argentina, locations which have not birthed nomadic societies. Another example can be found in the great rivers of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Both birthed the Egyptiac and Sumeric societies, respectively. When we look at other riparian environments, such as the Danube and the Mississippi, we fail to find any naturally occurring non-primitive societies. Chapter 5, Challenge and Response. 1. The mythological clue. Toynbee asserts that by arguing for race or environment as the positive factor, we are employing methods of physical science. This approach is insufficient for history, as it is the study of living beings as opposed to inanimate matter. Toynbee then proceeds to adopt what he terms a mythological approach. He argues the positive factor is not single but multiple, or rather the relationship between 2 forces. He utilises the examples of encounters between superhuman personalities, such as that of God and the serpent in the book of Genesis, or encounters between a mythical virgin and father, such as Europa and the bull. The God and Adam and Eve initially are in harmony, and stasis, but an intruding factor such as the serpent in the book of Genesis sets doubt and distress in place as a kind of stimulus. Toynbee likens the intrusion to a challenge or devil's wager, which the challenged must take up. Sometimes the challenger wins, as is the case with the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. However, the challenger can also lose, as is the case with Satan's intrusion into God's domain in the book of Job. Successfully overcoming the challenge, Toynbee likens to the rock climber who successfully scales a cliff face. The challenge is a threat to the human protagonist, which sets in motion God's creativity to rescue the situation. However, the progress has to be paid for by the human protagonist, whose purpose is to triumph through suffering. 2. The myth applied to the problem. Toynbee seeks to test his theory of challenge and response against the history of the 21 civilizations to see if it is in fact the positive factor. Factors of race and environment will still be considered in the assessment, but as complementary forces. Toynbee admits that challenge and response has an unknown quality, and it's impossible to perfectly predict what course a civilization will take when presented with a dilemma. The genesis of the Egyptiac civilization. When we dealt with environmental factors in the previous chapter, an assumption had been made that physical conditions are static. This is not the case if we look to the example of the Afrasian steppe. The area has been inhabited by primitive societies during the Ice Age, but afterwards had become desiccated. Societies which did not adapt to the changes adequately through finding a new habitat or changing their customs perished or persisted in a state of primitivism. Only the precursors of the Egyptiac and Sumeric societies successfully adopted a new habitat and changed their customs as a double reaction to prosper and grow. The change in habitat wasn't so much as a matter of distance, but of environment, as the former grasslands had become harsh deserts. The people of the Egyptiac and Sumeric societies embraced the floodplains of the Nile Delta and Mesopotamia respectively. The change of custom was from that of the hunter-gatherer to the farmer and the shepherd. Toynbee also notes that if we compare the inhabitants of Sudan to Egypt, we will note that the country had experienced a far greater degree of primitivism. This is because the environment of Sudan is closer to the original environmental condition of Egypt. In other words, the Sudanese ancestors did not take up the challenge as the Egyptians did and adapted to a new habitat and lifestyle. Another observation Toynbee makes is that the contemporary challenge Africans were facing at the intrusion of the Western civilization into their part of the world. In this case, it is a human rather than environmental challenge, but as stated previously, we can't adequately predict how events will play out as we are living through them. The genesis of Sumeric civilization. Like the Egyptiac, the Sumeric also accomplished a double reaction and adapted to a new environment and lifestyle, and there are many cultural similarities in the art and religion of the two civilizations. The main feat of the Sumeric was the mastering of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers via the construction of canals and draining of the soil for agriculture. However, a later environmental challenge in the form of the marshes of southern Mesopotamia was too much for the Sumeric and its Babylonic successor to overcome and adapt to. The genesis of the Cynic civilization. The Cynic civilization originated in the Yellow River Valley and had to overcome an even greater challenge than either the Egyptiac or the Sumeric. The Yellow River Valley is prone to greater extremes of temperature, ranging from very hot to very cold. This is the only explanation that makes sense, as the rest of China is inhabited by the same racial group, broadly speaking, who do not produce a civilization on the same level as the Cynic. The genesis of the Mayan and Andean civilizations. Mayan civilization was challenged into growth through the dense rainforests of Central America, which it had to tame in order to make room for agriculture. In contrast, the Andean civilization had two challenges that faced it: the Andean Plateau with its poor soil and climate, and the Pacific coast with its extreme heat and drought-like conditions. They responded to the first challenge through the use of retaining walls to construct terrace farms, and they responded to the latter challenge through irrigating the coastal plains. The genesis of the Minoan civilization. The Minoan civilization was faced with a challenge unique to the unrelated civilizations, being that of the sea itself. Crete, though geographically closer to Egypt and Anatolia, was actually settled by nomads from the Afrasian steppe. Toynbee argues this is the case because the Minoans were long heads, like the Egyptiacs and Sumerics, and not broad heads, like the people of Greece and Anatolia. Therefore, the nomads met an even greater challenge than their fellow peoples, who founded the Egyptiac and Sumeric civilizations. This they met by crossing the hundreds of miles of sea to find a new homeland. The genesis of the affiliated civilizations. The challenge of the affiliated civilizations met was primarily a human challenge through environmental factors, though they had their role to play. This human challenge came in the form of a dominant minority which struggled with the internal and external proletariats until the latter is victorious and breaks away to found a new civilization. This leads to a period of vitality for the new civilization as the older parent society dies out. An environmental challenge presents itself to the new civilization, especially in cases of physical displacement, as with our Western society with its origins in Western Europe, as opposed to the Mediterranean centre of the Hellenic civilization. However, not all affiliated civilizations had to face an environmental challenge, such as the main body of the Orthodox Christian civilization or the Arabic and Iranic civilizations. Chapter 6: The Virtues of Adversity. A stricter test. Toynbee asserts that the popular view of environmental factors is that a soft and comfortable environment is what breeds civilization. From what he has been mentioning previously, he asserts that the opposite is true. It can be easy as a modern observer to look at the present environmental conditions in places like Greece or Egypt and assume the ancient civilizations were always accustomed to such as a developed landscape. However, in this chapter, Toynbee wants to address an aspect of where, as was noted with the Sumeric society, what a civilization can succeed and fail on the same land and climate. Central America. As mentioned in the previous chapter, the Mayan civilization had to contest with the challenge of the encroaching rainforest. Toynbee could see in his day, centuries after the fall of the Mayans, that nature in her revenge has swallowed the old Mayan cities of Copan, Tikal, and Palenque. What is noteworthy is there is no modern presence in these areas or attempts to reclaim these old cities. They have just been left to nature. Ceylon. The island is covered in dams and water tanks that were used to collect water from the rainy side to irrigate the dry side. The ruins of such structures still remain. Toynbee notes that at the time of writing, one half of Ceylon is desolate, whilst the other half contains all the country's coffee, tea, and rubber production, which can function thanks to the rainfall. The North Arabian Desert. The cities of Petra and Palmyra were once thriving hubs of trade and well irrigated despite their positions in the desert. Their relapse into dry husks of their former selves is not dissimilar to the Mayan example. Nature has taken her revenge and reclaimed man's domains. Easter Island. The island is home to Polynesian natives and its famous stone statues. When one looks at the primitive nature of the inhabitants, you can conclude it was not they who built the statues. Toynbee suspects that a much older group of Polynesians met the challenge of navigating the sea to migrate to the island and then met the challenge of constructing the statues over many generations. Perhaps the current population are descended from the original people who crossed the sea and have degenerated from their ancestors by some degree. New England. Toynbee here draws on a personal anecdote. He once visited the village of Town Hill in rural Connecticut. Though its church still stood, all the houses had been abandoned and had become overgrown. It turned out that the village had been occupied for some 200 years before everyone left to migrate westwards. Out of the desolation of Town Hill rose the new cities of Ohio, Illinois, Colorado, and California. The Roman Campagna. Toynbee draws a comparison with the previous example. He notes how Livy was dismayed at a similar occurrence to Town Hill, which occurred in ancient Rome. The land of the Campagna, modern-day Campania in Italy, was once cultivated by the yeoman citizenry of the Republic, but by Livy's days the areas had become desolate and abandoned. Indeed, Toynbee notes that the energy that went into developing the area was directed to the further afield provinces of the Roman Empire. Perfida Capua. Here, Toynbee comes to a new observation that of a people and how they engaged with an easy environment. These can be split into two groups: those who knew a hard land and subsequently found a soft new environment, and those who never knew a hard environment. One example of the latter was the city of Capua, who was content to sit idle and let herself be conquered and dominated by her neighbours. First the Samnites and later the Romans themselves, Capua would even open her gates to Hannibal during the Second Punic War. The advice of Artembares. Toynbee draws on an anecdote from Herodotus. Cyrus the Great received advice from his courtier Artembares that after becoming king of the Persians, he should move his people from the rocky terrain of Iran to easier country. Cyrus dismisses his advice as soft countries breed soft men. The Odyssey and the Exodus. Toynbee now turns to the Odyssey, arguing that Odysseus faced a greater threat from the comforts of the land of the Lotus Eaters and charms of Calypso than he ever did from the Cyclops. He then goes on to the Israelites of the Exodus, who steered from the flesh pots of Egypt and hardened themselves for the 40 years in the desert. The Do As You Likes. Here, Toynbee turns to the land of Nyasaland, where the land is so bountiful that the inhabitants do not need to work. Furthermore, he then turns to the Victorian moralist Charles Kingsley, whose short story The History of the Great and Famous Nation of Do As You Likes, featuring a country of indolent people who pay a penalty by degenerating. If we go back to the early example of the Book of Genesis, the Garden of Eden was the soft environment that man was expelled from, and he is forced to become active and industrious on earth. Chapter 7. The Challenge of the Environment. Part 1. The Stimulus of Hard Countries. Lines of Inquiry. Toynbee reasserts that ease is inimical to civilization, but we must now inquire further and beg the question that of does the harsher an environment become, the greater the growth of civilization. He says we need to look at the evidence for and against. There are many examples which he splits into two groups, that of the physical environment and the human environment. Toynbee deals with the first example, which he further breaks down into comparisons of respective stimulating effects of physical environments with present different degrees of difficulty, and comparisons between the benefits of old ground and new ground. The Yellow River and the Yangtze. Toynbee here draws a comparison between China's two great river valleys. We have already established in a previous chapter that Toynbee considers the Yellow River Valley to be the birth of Sinic civilization. Here he further elaborates his reasoning, as the river has never been particularly navigable and fluctuates between rather extreme conditions, from being frozen in the winter. The river then melts and causes great destructive floods in the spring, which alter the channels and ultimate course and flow. Swamps are created in the old channels, and the land has to be drained to make it usable. In contrast, the Yangtze has always been navigable and is far less prone to flooding, and the winters are less severe. Attica and Boeotia. Comparing two adjacent regions of Greece, Toynbee elaborates on why Athens became a dominant city-state and the main stimulus for growth in Hellenic civilization. Boeotia is a land quite unique in the Greek landscape, as it has good quality soil and had a reputation for agriculture but also for a simple and rustic culture. He contrasts this to Attica, where Athens was located, a rocky environment like the rest of Greece where the soil is of a substandard quality after centuries of denudation. After the Athenians could no longer rely on the pastures, they grew olives and exported and traded the oil for grain, which had to be shipped by jars, which incentivized the pottery industry. Furthermore, trade requires money, which the Athenians fulfilled through mining silver. All this wealth allowed Athens to finance her artistic and intellectual accomplishments. Byzantium and Chalcedon. Comparing two Greek colonies situated on the European and Asian sides of the Bosporus respectively, Toynbee surmises that Chalcedon initially was seen as a better positioned city, as it was able to function as an agricultural colony. In contrast, Byzantium was unable to function in the same way due to barbarian raids. However, she did have one significant advantage over Chalcedon, that of her commanding position to control traffic in and out of the Bosporus. This strength helped ensure that it was an important city strategically throughout history. Israelites, Phoenicians, and Philistines. In this section, Toynbee looks at three groups of people belonging to the Syriac society. The Philistines are viewed as a barbaric people. This is noteworthy as Toynbee established in the introduction they are the inheritors of the legacy of the Minoan society, and Toynbee suspects that they may have invented the first alphabet. He contrasts them to the Phoenicians and Israelites, whose home territory enables growth and development. The former were situated in Lebanon and the Syrian coast, but sparse and harsh land not fit for agriculture, and was not desired by potential invaders. From their position, the Phoenicians explored the Mediterranean and founded Carthage, who had expanded across North Africa and Spain. The Israelites Toynbee credits with the creation of monotheism. From their home in Judah, a land of thin soil and forested hills, they lived in isolation for centuries. They surpassed both the Philistines and the Phoenicians through their pursuit of the kingdom of God before all else, and would eventually take the lands of the Philistines and become wealthier than the Phoenicians. Indeed, the Israelites still maintain an identity to the present day, whilst the Philistines and Phoenicians have been lost to history. Brandenburg and the Rhineland. Here, Toynbee contrasts the historic territory of Prussia with the surrounding lands of Germany and the Baltic. Prussia was largely sparse and possessed sandy soil, and was settled as part of the German frontier. This produced the country that would go on to unite Germany and achieve levels of education and productivity that all the West now emulates. Scotland and England. Toynbee states it is self-evident that the former is a harder country than the latter, and has bred a stern, industrious people, in contrast to the jovial Englishman. It then goes on to affirm a popular conception that Scotsmen are overrepresented in the making of the British Empire, and especially in the ranks of the Prime Ministers. The struggle for North America. In the middle of the 17th century, there were four different colonial powers in North America: the Spanish in Mexico and southwestern United States, the French in Quebec, the Dutch in the Hudson Bay, and the English in Virginia and New England. Toynbee comments that an observer most likely would have surmised that the French would be the most likely to rise to dominance of the continent due to their overwhelming power in Europe compared to the Spanish and the Dutch. The New Englanders would be doomed as they are hemmed in by the French and the Dutch. As we go through history to 1701, with the removal of the Dutch and the expansion of the French, the assessment that the latter would dominate still seems to be holding. However, if we are to jump forward to 1803 and the Louisiana Purchase, we can see that the French, like the Dutch, have been all but removed from the continent and the English-speaking colonists have triumphed. The next prediction Toynbee entertains is the idea that it appeared the Southerner would dominate the new Union, as it appeared was the case in the early 19th century. However, he would be trounced by his Yankee rival by the latter's industrial supremacy and the military conquest in the Civil War. Toynbee concludes that the victory of the Yankee was down to the hard environment of New England. Part 2. The Stimulus of New Ground. In this section, Toynbee compares the growth of civilizations on territories that started with civilizations on newly settled or conquered territories. Going back to the Adam and Eve example, after their expulsion from the Garden of Eden, they settled the new ground of earth and transitioned man from the life of the hunter-gatherer to the life of the farmer. Toynbee also returns to the example of the Israelites, as after their exodus from Egypt, they settled the new ground of Judah and established the foundations of Syriac society. Furthermore, he turns to the examples of Christianity and Buddhism, which both had greater success in spreading in new lands of Europe and East Asia, respectively, than they did in their home territories of the Levant and India, respectively. Toynbee then looks at the successor societies of the Hindu and the Iranic, who were able to sufficiently develop on new conquered land. The Hindu society was able to assimilate southern India into its namesake religious faith, even acquiring much of its defining character in the process. The Iranic absorbed its sister Arabic society and then created two empires on the grounds of other civilizations, the Ottoman Empire for the Orthodox Christian civilization and the Mughal Empire for the Hindu civilization. We then come to the Orthodox Christian civilization, where Toynbee argues that there had been successive new grounds, that of Anatolia followed by the Balkans and then Russia, each serving as the core of the society. He then goes on to look at the stimulus of overseas colonisation, describing how newly colonised cities outshine their original settlements, in particular that of Carthage, Syracuse, and the Etruscan settlements in northern Italy. Toynbee then looks at other examples of transmarine migration, such as the migration of the Angles and the Jutes to Britain, the Viking conquest and the migration of the Irish Scots to northern Britain. During these migrations, the resettling people have had to adapt their customs to the new land, and it is noted by Toynbee that the people of newly settled lands tend to produce greater works of culture, as the Elder Edda for the Norsemen and Beowulf for the Anglo-Saxons. Furthermore, he then identifies that transmarine migration also has the effect of changing the political structure of a culture, such as the Greek colonies of the Anatolian coast, which were bound together by comradeship as opposed to the kinship as was traditional. Toynbee also argues that England's development of a parliamentary government was also as a result of the English abandoning the kinship ties of their Germanic forebears. Part 3. The Stimulus of Blows. In this section, Toynbee looks at the first examples of pressure from the human environment. In this case, the stimulus of blows refers to these instances of sudden increases in external pressure. He identifies that the nature of such pressure is an enemy military force, and there are two occasions for such an event. These are either to be crushed utterly or to overcome the defeat and rise again stronger, and Toynbee argues the latter outcome is the historical norm. For an example, he turns to Rome after her defeat by the Gauls at the Battle of Allia in 387 BC, and the subsequent sack of Rome. The Romans were humbled, but within 50 years had bounced back and once more held a dominant position within Italy. For another example, Toynbee turns to the Ottoman defeat at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 AD and the subsequent capture of Sultan Bayezid I. Again, despite this setback, the Ottomans would recover, and 50 years later, Mehmed IV would conquer Constantinople. Toynbee then looks to the examples of those who are repeatedly defeated and yet continue to rise again. He firstly looks at Rome's rivals in Carthage and Macedon. Though they would both suffer significant defeats, they both rebounded to challenge the Romans again before final defeat and conquest. From here we then come to the example of the Austrian Empire, a state which survived several rapid blows from France during the Napoleonic Wars, before finally emerging triumphant. Toynbee then also looks at Prussia, who also suffered a blow from Napoleon in 1806 at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt. But from this, she also recovered and would go on to achieve German reunification. More significantly, the new Germany would then suffer its own blow during the Great War and would make the beginnings of a recovery during the writing of a study of history. The ultimate example of a stimulating effect from a blow is the Greco-Persian War of 480 to 479 BC, which resulted in the occupation and destruction of Athens. From this nadir, she would rise again and dominate Greece's classical period. For a final example, Toynbee looks to a non-military case, that of the triumph of Christianity in the Roman world, as the crucifixion and the persecution of Christian worship would be great blows from which the faithful would endure. Indeed, they would prove ultimately victorious in the spread of their faith and its adoption by the empire. Part 4. The Stimulus of Pressures. In this section, Toynbee looks at further examples of pressure from the human environment. In this case, stimulus of pressures refers to people or territories exposed to pressure over a very long period. These tend to be frontier provinces or territories at the edge of civilization. In the Egyptiac world, Toynbee identifies that in Egyptian history, its politics have been dominated by its two halves, that of Upper and Lower Egypt respectively. Both at various times have been the frontier under pressure. Upper Egypt was dominant in the earlier history pre-New Kingdom, when Egypt's principal antagonist was the Kingdom of Kush in modern-day Sudan. However, after the establishment of the New Kingdom and the conquest and assimilation of the Nubians, the main centre of pressure shifted to Lower Egypt, where the main source of pressure was from Libyan tribes and Asian kingdoms such as the Hittites. In the Iranic world, Toynbee compares fortunes of two Turkish beyliks that emerged after the collapse of the Sultanate of Rum, that of the Ottomans in Bithynia and the Karamanids in Iconium. The former became great conquerors and forged an empire because their initial territory had been the frontier with the remains of the Byzantine Empire, whilst the Karamanids were stuck with an interior territory subject to no pressure and would later be conquered by the Ottomans. What is interesting is a comparison Toynbee draws with the earlier Byzantine Empire, when Iconium was a frontier as opposed to an interior province. The pressure from the Arab caliphates created the Anatolic Army Corps, one of the finest units of the East Roman army. In Russian Orthodox Christendom, the Mongol invasion of Russia in the 13th century and the subsequent pressure from the Golden Horde on the steppes led to the rise of the Cossacks. These people were able to outmatch the nomadic warrior through their adaptability as they adopted new weapons, were more adept at agriculture and the navigation of Russia's many rivers, which was seen as an obstacle by the nomads. These warriors helped Russia conquer the various steppe peoples and to explore and conquer Siberia. There would also be a western pressure from Poland and Sweden, from which Russia would overcome by the time of Peter the Great. In the Western world, over against continental barbarians. In this section, Toynbee discusses the expansion of the Western society's frontiers in response to frontier barbarians. This first occurred in Frankish Austrasia, the modern-day Rhineland under Charlemagne. His many campaigns against the Saxons expanded the frontiers from the Rhine to the Elbe. From here, Otto the Great would further expand the frontiers via his conquest of Wendish lands. However, by this vast conquest of barbarian land, the Western and Orthodox frontiers finally met, and the former frontier territories of the Rhineland and Saxony would lapse. Indeed, Toynbee would trace the decline of the Holy Roman Empire to the lack of a pressurized frontier, creating further energetic rulers like Charlemagne or Otto the Great. Men like Frederick Barbarossa would come along as an exception. In the Western world against the Ottoman Empire, Hungary had initially acted as a bulwark against the Ottoman expansion. However, after the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 AD, the Austrian Habsburgs would become the primary defender of Europe. Toynbee categorises the period of 1529 to 1683, or the time lapse between the two sieges of Vienna, as a heroic age of the Habsburg monarchy, where it at first halted the Ottoman advance into Europe and began the Ottoman retreat back to Thrace. However, the Ottoman Empire's relapse into the sick man of Europe meant the end of a stimulating pressure on the Habsburgs, who would decline in retrospect to the other great powers, and would even meet the same fate as the Ottoman Empire at the end of the Great War. Toynbee then provides a further contrast as the post-war Turkey was able to fight back and achieve better terms for itself as a result of the Greco-Turkish War. On the other hand, Austria would remain with its post-war boundaries. In the Western world on its western frontiers, in conjunction with the pressure of continental barbarians that has been discussed previously, Toynbee looks to three examples of pressure on the western frontiers of the Western society. These are the Celtic fringe in the British Isles and Brittany, the Scandinavian Vikings and Muslim Spain. The pressure from the Celtic fringe resulted in the creation of England and Scotland out of the Heptarchy. The Scots would conquer Lothian, then a domain of the Kingdom of Northumbria in 954 AD. However, they would adopt their culture and language of their new territory, thereby extending the Western society over the whole of the island of Britain. Toynbee contrasts Lothian to the fate of Yorkshire, which once constituted the core of Northumbria, and the Viking Danelaw. and is now a regional county of England and nothing more. When looking into the creation of England, there were two contenders out of Mercia and Wessex, both enduring pressure from the Welsh and the Cornish, respectively. Though Mercia was the leading power of a time under Offa, it was Wessex under Alfred the Great that would ultimately form a basis for a united England. Ironically, the pressure from the Scandinavian Vikings would prove far greater in influence on the creation of England than that of the Celtic fringe. Toynbee also identifies that the Kingdom of France was fashioned out of the pressure the Vikings had placed on the Carolingian Empire. He also notes that French accomplishments with the Viking Normans, what the English had done with the Scots, and assimilated another people into the society. In respect to Muslim Spain, this must have been seen as a culmination of the Syriac eruption, which had been a reaction to the Hellenic imposition on its own land. Not content with the recreation of a universal state in its own lands, it pushed out across northern Africa and into Iberia in 713 AD, and then up the Loire before being pushed back by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD. The pressure in Iberia upon the Christian West begat Spain and Portugal, who would drive out the Moor over the next several centuries. They would then go on to explore and colonise the rest of the world as an extension of the vitality and energy that had been built up from the pressure. However, after the final pressure had been removed following the expulsion of the Moriscos in the second half of the 16th century, the Spanish and Portuguese would be eclipsed by the English, the French and the Dutch in the colonial sphere. Part 5. The Stimulus of Penalisations. Lamesmiths and Blind Poets. Toynbee here discusses groups that face some form of restriction on activities they can perform. This usually leads to specialisation in what they can practice. He uses the analogy of a lame or blind man in a barbarian warrior society. The former, though he can't walk, can still use his hands to smith armour and weapons. The latter can still string a harp and fashion songs of the other warriors' great deeds. Slavery. Toynbee begins by discussing the vast influx of slaves into Roman Italy between the Second Punic War and the Augusta Pax Romana. These people were either Greek or Oriental peoples from the East, and they responded to the challenges of slavery, for either hard work to become trusted servants of their Roman masters, or some saved what they could and brought their freedom. However, the greatest triumph was through the Roman state's recognition of various new gods and cults. Deities such as Mithras, Cybele, and Isis became legitimised forms of worship. Christianity too entered the Roman society in this manner. He then turns to the position of African Americans who, even several decades after the abolition of slavery, still suffer some form of social penalisation. Toynbee argues that they have already started to embrace Christianity as the religion of the humble and downtrodden, and they breathe a new energy into what has become a dead religion as a form of mass social consolation. Phanariots, Kazanlis, and Levantines. In this section, Toynbee discusses three groups which endured religious persecution. Firstly, he looks at the Phanariots, the Orthodox Greek community of Constantinople, who, unable to bear arms and fight as soldiers, became merchants instead and dominated trade. After the setback of the 1683 siege of Vienna, the Ottomans began to rely on the Phanariots as diplomats and ambassadors to treat with the Western powers, thereby granting them a privileged position within the Ottoman government. However, the contact with the West infected some Phanariots with revolutionary ideas, and the inability for the community to pick a course of independence or mastery of the Ottoman Empire would prove their downfall. After the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence in 1821, the Ottomans would never again trust Orthodox Greeks in such high positions of authority, and would culminate in the expulsion of all non-Turkish elements from Anatolia. For a comparison, Toynbee then looks to the Kazan Tatars in Russia, a Turkic people who were in not a too dissimilar position to the Phanariots in the Ottoman Empire, in that they were largely a penalised religious group whose domain was largely trade. Toynbee rejects that the animosity between Greeks and Turks is out of any specific racial or religious animus between the two peoples, but rather as a circumstance when a religious minority finds itself in a penalised position by a different group. Toynbee then looks at another example, that of the Catholic populations in the Levant. These people sometimes were of European blood, but their position as penalised minorities made them adapt to what trades they could. What is noteworthy, as this gave them a character very different to Catholic Europeans. Toynbee argues that the Turks and Catholic Europeans were both masters of their own house and had more in common than either did with the Levantine Catholics. The Jews. Toynbee looks at the Jews because they are the main example of a fossil of an extinct society that have faced penalisation. He seeks to determine whether the Jewish character is something distinct to their group or rather as a result of penalisation. Firstly, we look at the Ashkenazi or European Jews, who inhabited various European countries over the centuries, though they are mostly concentrated in the east in Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. Toynbee argues that these Jews only maintain a distinctive character as a result of penalisation, and when you look at Ashkenazi Jews in Western Europe and the United States, where they are no longer penalised, they readily assimilate into the culture and lose their Jewishness. In contrast, the Sephardic Jews of Iberia faced no such penalisation under Muslim rule, but were faced with a choice when the Christian Reconquista drove out the Muslim rulers. Some converted and assimilated into the culture of Spain and Portugal, whilst others who did not convert were expelled and settled in the Ottoman Empire, where they became a distinct culture. Toynbee then looks to the split in Ashkenazi Jewish culture between those who support assimilation into their host countries and those who support Zionism. Despite no longer facing penalisation, there is not enough for Zionists who still seek a homeland for the Jewish people and want a distinct ethno-religious identity. Chapter 8. The Golden Mean. Part 1. Enough and Too Much. Here, Toynbee surmises that the 5 environmental challenges discussed in the previous chapter prove the validity of his theory of challenge and response. However, how far can we take this concept and will infinitely increasing the challenge lead to a correspondingly spectacular response? He wonders if there is an example of an excessive challenge and looks to the cases of Venice, the Netherlands, and Switzerland as 3 states that met the challenge of an incredibly difficult physical environment. However, these physical environments are what spared these states from a human challenge for a very long time, as they made them difficult to invade. Toynbee then also argues that though one society or people are unable to overcome a challenge, it doesn't mean another culture won't fail the challenge. For an example, he looks to the early barbarians of Europe who were unable to adequately tame the forests in Northern Europe, but their civilized successors in Western society were much more successful. The same is true of the Romans who conquered Cisalpine Gaul, modern-day northern Italy, where they were able to create much more developed society and culture than the barbarian Gauls who had occupied the area before. Toynbee then moves to an example of the human environment, whereby both the Celts and the Germanic barbarians attempted to respond to the challenge of an encroaching Hellenic society. The Celts would try and fail to destroy the Hellenic society in 390 BC when Rome was sacked, and again during the invasion of Macedonia in 279 BC. In response, the Romans would conquer the entire Celtic world. The German barbarians would prove far more successful and were responsible for the destruction of the Hellenic civilization. We then turn to 5 Syriac responses to the challenge represented by the Hellenic society: the Zoroastrian, Jewish, Nestorian, Monophysite, and Islamic. The latter proving to be the only successful one. Toynbee concludes that a new approach is required if we are to find a challenge that cannot be sufficiently overcome. Part 2. Comparisons in 3 terms. A new approach to the problem. Toynbee summarises that thus far we have established that reducing the severity of the challenge can lead to a diminished response. However, would the other extreme of raising the challenge to such a severe level lead to a corresponding rise in the level of response? If not, then we can establish that the concept of challenge and response is subject to the law of diminishing returns. It then goes on over several examples to test this theory. Norway, Iceland, Greenland. As established in the previous chapter, the Vikings who settled Greenland were able to meet the challenge of a harsher environment than their homeland and produce great works of culture. Therefore, we then answer a further migration west to an even more harsh and inhospitable land, produce even greater works of culture. If we look at the example of Greenland, then the answer is no, as the Viking settlers were unable to overcome the challenge of this even harsher environment than Iceland. Dixie, Massachusetts, Maine. We've already compared the physical environment of the southern United States with that of New England and concluded that the latter was the more challenging environment. However, there is a greater distinction here as the southern states of New England, that of Massachusetts, Rhode Island and Connecticut, possess a physical environment that is not too harsh. In contrast, the other 3 northern states of New England, that of Maine, New Hampshire and Vermont, possess a much harsher climate not too dissimilar to the Canadian provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. This harsh environment has resulted in these states being somewhat of a backwater compared to southern New England, which still retains an important economic and cultural position. Brazil, La Plata, Patagonia. The South American Atlantic seaboard presents a similar case to the North American Atlantic seaboard, albeit in the other direction. Brazil's climate is less stimulating than the more temperate area of the River Plate, where we find the modern countries of Argentina and Uruguay. And we can keep going south, we will find the land of Patagonia, whose climate is too harsh and results in the area's reputation as a backwater. Galloway, Ulster, Appalachia. In this next example, Toynbee relies on human as well as physical factors. He starts by drawing a contrast between the Ulstermen of Northern Ireland with their Southern Irish counterparts. The former are much more productive and industrious, and he argues that this is a result of the Ulsterman meeting a double challenge. This double challenge was firstly migrating to a new land from their original Highland domains, and also having to fight the native Irish inhabitants for control of the land. However, when the Ulsterman migrates to the United States and settles the mountainous areas of the eastern United States, he does not recreate civilization but rather lapses back into the barbarity of his original Highland domains. Reactions to the ravages of war. We have previously looked at how responses to the challenge of war can be met, as in the case of Athens against the Persians and Prussia against France, but there are cases where the cost of war can be too much. The main example of this Toynbee is concerned with is the Second Punic War, which devastated the agriculture of Italy. But once there had been Roman farmers tilling the soil, there was now large estates worked by slaves. The displaced Roman citizens were forced into the cities to become urban proletariat. The tensions from an economically deprived populace led to attempts at political reform by the Gracchi brothers. When this failed, the drastic adoption of a dictatorial form of government under the Caesars was the result. In Toynbee's view, the Second Punic War had a regressive effect on Roman civilization rather than a progressive effect which Athens enjoyed post-Persian invasion. Chinese reactions to the challenge of immigration. Toynbee notes in this section how Chinese immigrants perform differently depending on where they immigrate to. If they emigrate to a European colony in Asia, such as British Malaya or the Dutch East Indies, they perform well as they are protected and encouraged to do so by the colonial government. By contrast, if a Chinaman emigrates to California or Australia, a white man's country, so to speak, not only are they discouraged from migrating there, but are actively penalised once they are there. As a result, they do not perform as well as their co-ethnics who went to Malaya or the East Indies. Slavs, Achaeans, Teutons, Celts. In this part, Toynbee considers the response of different barbarian groups to the challenge of civilization. He starts with the Achaeans, who encountered the Minoan society as an external proletariat, who subsequently conquered the Minoans after learning from them and begat the Hellenic civilization, granting the new society their Achaean religion. This new Hellenic society then presented a challenge to the Germanic barbarians, who responded by destroying the remnants of the Hellenic society that was left. In contrast, the Slavic barbarians of Eastern Europe were for the longest time isolated from major civilizations, so did not develop significantly for centuries, and only after forced migrations by the Avars led them to having some proximity to civilization. Though the Germanic barbarians were more successful than the Celts, as has been discussed previously, they were not ultimately victorious in Toynbee's view, as they then converted to Christianity, the universal church of Hellenic society's internal proletariat. In conclusion, the Slavs and Celts both suffered from a lack of challenge and an overbearing challenge respectively, whilst the Achaeans and Germanic tribes enjoyed a more optimum challenge, though the former was more successful than the latter. Part 3. Two abortive civilizations. The rearguard of the Teutonic Volkswanderung. Here, Toynbee explains his concept of abortive civilizations, peoples or societies who showed promise of establishing independent civilization, but would eventually succumb to pressure and become absorbed into another civilization. The two examples he gives are the far western or Celtic Christians found in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany, and the remaining Germanic pagans in Scandinavia. Both of these groups would outperform the Germanic barbarians that destroyed the Hellenic society, as they would outlast them against the pressure of civilization from the Christian Church. The abortive far western Christian civilization. The Celtic fringe had a unique response to Christianity, as in Toynbee's view it adapted Christianity to its own religious traditions and culture. What ensured this was the Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain, as the outlying Christian territories were now cut off from the rest of the Christian world for a first time. From the 7th century AD, we then see a contest between the Insular Church and the Continental Church over who can convert the rest of the pagans in the British Isles. Both churches launched missions, with the Continental Church converting the southern Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Insular Church converting the Scots. Both would clash over the conversion of Northumbria, with the latter losing out at the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD. The continued isolation rendered Ireland vulnerable to the Viking raids, though she would eventually drive out the invaders at the Battle of Clontarf. The invasion and conquest of Ireland by Henry II of England, with papal blessing, was the final death knell of the far western civilization. The abortive Scandinavian civilization. The Scandinavian pagans were in a similar situation to the Celtic Christians in their isolation. After the Germanic barbarians had migrated into the former Roman territories, the Slavs had migrated westward into areas of Central and Eastern Europe. thereby partially cutting off Scandinavia from the rest of Europe. The only significant difference was that the Scandinavians remained pagan and did not convert for centuries. The Viking raids and migrations were a response to the campaigns of Charlemagne, whose 30-year conquest of Saxony, which overturned decades of peaceful penetration and conversion by missionaries. Toynbee compares the Viking conflict with the Western society to the Celtic conflict with the Hellenic society, and argues the former was far more successful at presenting a credible threat. Once the initial onslaught was over, the Western society resorted to its own original strategy of peaceful conversions, which was extremely effective against pagans that had not conquered parts of the Western society, such as the Vikings of the Danelaw or the Normans in France. The conversion effort was then taken to Scandinavia proper. What is also noteworthy is that the Scandinavian society was partitioned, so to speak, between the Western and Orthodox societies, as the latter had its own conflict with the pagans and also successfully converted the Russian pagan states. Part 4. The impact of Islam on the Christendoms. In conclusion to this chapter, Toynbee finishes up with the impact of Islamic invasions and the conflict with the Christian societies. We've already discussed previously that the Muslim conquest of Iberia and intrusion into France resulted in a response that led to the Christian reconquest of Iberia, and by extension the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Another impact that has not been considered was in the intellectual sphere, as many works of Hellenic society were translated by the Muslims, which then found their way into the hands of the Western society. The same outcome happened in the Levant as a result of the Crusades. By contrast, the Islamic conquests and wars with the Eastern Roman Empire proved far too damaging, as in response, the Byzantines promoted the Roman state over the Orthodox Church, and this led to destructive wars with the Bulgarians, which was the downfall of the Orthodox Christian society. To finish this section off, Toynbee turns to Ethiopia as a country, which is backwards because it has been insufficiently challenged throughout its history, whether by Muslims or European colonisers. These threats have been warded off by aid granted by the allies of Ethiopia rather than the country itself. Thank you all for listening to this presentation.